Hello, Mentioners, and welcome to another episode of the Mentionables podcast. I'm Joel Furches. Today's episode is a supplemental episode in which I will read the introduction to the first section of the Mentionable Project, which is the Mentionable signature written project together. In this project, we take the questions of an atheist, and 5 of us give answers to each question. As I read through this, you'll hear me say the name of the person, and then I'll be reading their response to the question. Enjoy the episode. Introduction. 40 Questions. Joel Furches. In his 2016 HubPage article, 40 Questions to Ask a Christian, atheist Thomas Swan, who describes himself as a doctor in the cognitive science of religion, suggests that in impromptu arguments between Christians and atheists, as opposed to structured debates, the best tactic an atheist can employ is to ask difficult questions, forcing the Christian to think through their position. Swan doesn't elaborate on the tactic except to say that, ultimately, thought is what an atheist should be trying to elicit. By asking the right questions, one can determine the direction that such thoughts take. Of course, it's admirable to encourage anyone, Christians, politicians, or salesmen, to think through their worldview and positions in life. But based on that phrasing, it appears that Swan is more concerned with taking the reins of the conversation so that they, the atheist, are in charge of the direction the conversation takes. This honestly sounds a bit like the atheist version of the tactics taken by Christian presuppositionalists. This is a Christian apologetics tactic which also relies on asking questions in order to direct the conversation. Under a presuppositional tactic, the Christian questions the standards and laws that the person assumes when making an argument. Asking things such as, "What makes such and such wrong?" will theoretically cause the person to admit that there exist transcendent standards, such as logic, justice, reason, beauty, love, etc., that people operate off when they think and speak. If transcendent standards exist, they must be based on some transcendent source. Instead of asking questions that backtrack along a person's line of reasoning, though, Swan's tactic seems to be more, ask a hypothetical question that places the Christian in circumstances where their worldview does not work. The Christian is forced to realize that Christianity, as a worldview, must necessarily fail under certain circumstances. The problem, or genius, depending on which side you're coming from, with hypothetical questions is that they stack the deck against the other person. The person to whom the question is directed is forced to assume the rules of the questioner in order to give an honest answer. For instance, Christians are sometimes found asking atheists, "If you die and find out God is real, what are you going to tell him?" It's a loaded question, because the atheist has to play by the rules of the question, and is trapped in the corner of imagining she was wrong. She isn't allowed by the question to argue for the truth of atheism, just imagine its failure. This is a pretty common tactic in the questions posed by Swan. He asks the Christian to imagine they exist under different circumstances, and then give some kind of honest answer to this entirely hypothetical situation. Consequently, the person addressing the question has 3 options. 1. Evade the question with answers that do not fully operate within the parameters of the hypothetical. 2. Admit that Swan is right. If they were placed in the scenario he describes, they would be forced to function by rules he lays out. Or 3. Question the question. Perhaps more ingenious still is that Swan's questions almost always demand a yes-no answer. The genius of this tactic is that one can trap the answer in a false dilemma, such that either answer is condemning the questioner. Much like the classic example, "Have you stopped beating your wife?" Answer yes, and you're more or less admitting that you have beaten your wife in the past. Answer no, and you're more or less admitting that you are currently beating your wife. If you are not a wife beater, the question does not offer you the option of explaining this. These tactics, hypothetical scenarios and false dilemmas, are worth looking out for in the questions in this series. In this document, members of the Mentionables will examine Swan's questions, both apologetically and tactically. Questions in this series may include answers from more than one mentionable, so as to give the reader a well-rounded catalog of responses from which to operate. The value of the series is that a number of the questions are actually being used regularly, typically in online exchanges, and sometimes even in formal debates, almost always in atheist memes that circulate the web. Moreover, Swan's tactic is actually in play in a number of dialogues. Having these Q's and A's will provide the reader with a handy catalog of reference when these questions arise. Read and absorb the answers, and it will make navigating exchanges about one's faith that much easier. Also, look at the tactics and strategies taken by the apologist to answer these questions. These may be valuable tactics when caught in these situations yourself. To atheist readers, it is worthwhile to see the Christian side of the equation, whether to consider the worldview in fair and robust manner, or to avoid asking questions that have already had solid answers. To begin, the reader will note that the questions have been broken up into categories labeled regarding X. These are Swan's categories that he assigns to the questions in the article 40 Questions to Ask Christians. Tyler Vela, Asking Difficult Questions. In this series, Swan is setting out to furnish atheists and agnostics with a list of questions that he believes will do a better job dismantling Christian dogmatism than direct approaches will. This project is similar to other attempts at Socratic tactics, like that of Peter Boghossian and his street epistemology. The problem here is that many modern unbelievers, like Swan, don't appear to have taken the time to understand the views which he is trying to dislodge from people. While I am glad that he admits parties on all sides of these discussions, ostensibly unbelievers included, can get bogged down by concerns of ego, then he goes on to poison the well by saying that Christians believe themselves to have wisdom that he clearly doesn't think they have, here ignoring the difference between wisdom and knowledge, true belief, and that they have not thought about their beliefs until the noble atheist gives them the opportunity to do so. This project of eliciting thought has been one of the goals of my ministry from the beginning, and to be frank, I have found the Brights to be rather obstinate against thinking outside of their own naturalistic worldview, of considering the challenges posed by those who stand in opposition to it. So what Swan really is attacking is not historic Orthodox Christianity, which has been held to and defended by some of the greatest minds in history, but rather to a kind of intellectual bottom-of-the-barrel, fundamentalistic, hyper-literal, anti-intellectual, legalistic, evangelical, and I use the term in the most broadly cultural sense. To that end, most Christians interested in having these discussions would themselves likely want those people to think more robustly about their views before they speak in public. It has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of Christianity, but with the anti-intellectual trappings of a very narrow sliver of Christendom present in the late modern Western secularized world. So as a Christian who takes my beliefs seriously, I can agree with Swan that marginal sets of Christians should engage in reasonable reflections on their beliefs more. But I think that can lead them to even deeper understanding and trust in the historic Christian faith, not towards a problematic and reflexively destructive naturalistic worldview like that of the modern atheist and agnostic. So let us explore the questions that he poses. My answers will be intentionally brief and will often be answers in the right direction, pointing toward where I think a full answer can be found. Regarding world religion. In the first segment of this article, Swan contrasts Christianity against other religions in the world, largely using the tact that this suggests that since Christians reject other religions, how can they accept their own? Intentionally or not, Swan's questions brush up against the Loftus outsider test, which calls upon Christians to reject their own faith for the same reason that they reject other religions, basically making the claim that if one religion can be reasonably rejected, they all can. This is essentially Swan's tact. One cannot both reject the claims of other religions and then accept Christianity. This line of reasoning is absurd upon the face of it. The fact that there is more than one explanation for a thing does not make all of those explanations false. Each must be judged upon its own merits. Number 1. If 100 different religions have to be wrong for yours to be right, does this show that people from all over the world like to invent gods that don't exist? Mark Lambert. If anything, this shows that people all over the world are capable of creative distortion. It actually seems far less likely that multiple diverse cultures would come up with similar invented deities and ideas about supernatural beings. A far more plausible scenario is that there is a kernel of truth which mankind took with them and which evolved then separately as they spread across the globe. Caleb Johnston. Multiple religions could point to a number of different things, not only the idea that cultures invent God. Dr. Gerald McDermott has written a number of books on the topic of God's rivals, offers a unique perspective on this. All religions, while not equal, do offer glimpses of truth that may make it easier for those believers to accept the truth of Christianity if they explore the evidence. This may sound naive, but considering the moral system of most religions, a unique element that offers a shadow of Christianity, it actually makes sense that God could prepare different people groups in different ways for the gospel, especially when you consider that Judaism missed their own Messiah. Now, with that said, this is no way supports a universalism, merely that God's methods and plans extend beyond the typical and into the transdimensional component that understands the course of human history and culture far better than we often do. This is also not to leave the explanation as a simple, God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes, though, I think we underestimate how well an omnipotent being would actually understand us, especially when we look at how Christianity has spread. It's almost as if the world was primed for it. Nick Peters. Let's suppose an event takes place today that is unexplained, such as a phenomena in the sky. Scientists gather around to try to come up with an explanation of the event. Many of these explanations contradict one another. Does this mean that some scientists are inventing explanations? Yes, it does to an extent. Some of these explanations could be based on data that we have, but to some extent there has to be some filling in the gaps. I think it's the same way with man trying to explain ultimate reality. An interesting aspect of ancient religions, which is not often discussed, is that many of them actually do start with a high God. In other words, our most primitive religions have been monotheistic at their roots. Do people need to explain things? Yes. Some explanations are better than others, but all are going by the information they have. Interestingly, something that has destroyed many false religions has been the dominance of monotheism. So much so that it is no longer asked if one is an atheist or a theist with respect to gods, so much as God. Polytheism isn't even a live option for many people in the West today. It is quite interesting to consider that one worldview that has done the most to establish monotheism has been Christianity. Even if one wants to say that Islam has spread monotheism as efficiently as Christianity has, Islam did it by following the groundwork laid by Christianity. It would be fallacious to say there are some false theistic beliefs, therefore all are false, just as it would be to say that there are some false scientific beliefs, therefore all scientific beliefs are false. Each case must be looked at on its own merits. Tyler Vela. The problem with this question is that it cuts backwards, like a chainsaw with a strong back kick. How would this be any different if posed to the atheist about their naturalism? As they love to point out, we simply believe in one more God than they do. So if believing that 99.9% of all other views are wrong for one's own view to be right, how is that less problematic for the person who believes that 99.99% of all other views are wrong? If this is a problem for the Christians, then it is at least marginally more problematic for the atheist. Now, if the atheist would like to respond by saying that the truth or falsity of other views is independent of the truth or falsity of their own worldview, or that the truth of their worldview categorically undermines the truth of others, then they must grant those same possible answers for the Christian, both of which I would be happy to employ. So whatever answer they would like to use to exempt themselves would equally exempt anyone else from the import of the question. What's good for the goose? Joel Furches. 100 is probably a modest estimate when it comes to the particular religions, assuming that Swan is talking about the span of time since the dawn of human existence. Indeed, humans do seem inherently religious, so much so that it would be practically impossible to find a person, atheist or religious, who doesn't know what you mean when you talk about God. The fact that people have been trying to discover the nature of God and how best to worship him since the dawn of time may equally be evidence of the actual existence of God. Swan's point is, no doubt, that people's inherent instinct toward religion explains the invention of God. But what explains people's inherent instinct toward religion? Swan would no doubt blame humans' religiosity on some cruel trick of evolution. But even if this were true, explaining how a belief arose does not suddenly make that belief incorrect. Who is to say that God did not use the process of evolution to make humans aware of his existence? For Christian readers, this is not to suggest that the process of Darwinian evolution is either true or false. Rather than defending a particular view of the origin of life, this response is intended to convey that evolution does not preclude the possibility of religious truth. If true, it could simply be the mechanism by which true belief arose. Built into the question, of course, are the dual dilemmas best phrased, with so many religions, how do you know yours is the right one? And, if God is real, why is there so much confusion about who he is and how to worship him? Of course, in answering the first question, one may trot out the classical apologetic arguments about how the evidence indicates that Christianity is the true religion. However, whatever logical force these arguments might contain, the second dilemma still exists. Assuming the truth of Christianity, this does not preclude the possibility of people being wrong about God. In fact, given what Christians call the fallenness of humans, that is, a separation of humans from their God because of a willing rebellion, it should not be at all surprising that people are mostly mistaken about God. If the existence of God has not been agreed upon, the atheist and Christian can still agree on the fallibility and overall ignorance of humans. Why should religion be any different than philosophy or science, wherein there are a number of schools of thought and no one agrees? The history of religion has shown that, as scientists and societies improve in their philosophy, theologies, and moral development, they tend to progress away from polytheism and toward monotheism. Aristotle and Plato, both from the heathen Greek culture, developed arguments which indicate a transcendent creator God rather than a pantheon, meaning that, as humans struggle to discover and worship God, they intuitively know their concept of God becomes ever more similar to the Christian God. Further, it should be noted that, beginning with the rise in the first century, the insignificant Christian movement ballooned across the map and rapidly became the largest world religion, where it remains today. Point being that while there have been hundreds of religions, there have also been hundreds of human misconceptions about every subject under the sun. And just as science becomes more refined as humans developed, so the idea of God begins to further resemble the Christian God as time goes on. Number 2. If your parents had belonged to a different religion, do you think you would belong to that religion too? Mark Lambert. Probably. However, there doesn't give any kind of answer to the far more important question about whether or not that religion is true. Caleb Johnston. Quite possibly, but that doesn't speak to the nature of what the question is really getting at. The institution is that religions are cultural. This is true to a certain extent. However, it says nothing about the superficiality of religions to many. Look at America and the number of superficial worshippers. Accepting a belief without investigation does not speak to its truthfulness. Also, this neglects the reason why Christianity would see such a significant spread across regions in a way seen not by other religions. Nick Peters. I probably would. We can't tell that kind of thing, but let's also consider something else. If I grew up in Oxford, Mississippi instead of Oxford, England, would I be less likely to believe in evolution? Probably. If I grew up in Eskimo territory, would I be more likely to think whale blubber is a delicacy instead of a Subway sandwich? Probably. If I grew up being taught the mathematical tables, should I automatically view those with suspicion? No. Of course, children should grow up to eventually learn to think for themselves, but for a time it's good to rely on their parents. Their parents know best about medicine, the dangers of the world outside the house, what TV shows and video games they shouldn't play, etc. Not all parents do well, but most do what they do the best by their children. Do many people just grow up being Christians because their parents said so and they never thought about it? Yes, that's also a shame. They're missing a rich investment in what they can say is the most important aspect of their lives. Any good parent should be willing to tell his or her children that if they cannot be convinced of the Christian worldview, they should hold to it. That's part of going where the evidence leads. At the same time, an equipped parent should be ready to answer questions about worldview. The same applies with atheist or other system. Those who value the ability to question and think for oneself should also not mind their own dogmas being questioned. If your child is convinced Jesus rose from the dead and you're an atheist, you should let them know they should believe Jesus rose from the dead. By all means, have a dialogue with them, and such just as Christian parents should do with Christians who become atheists. But belief or disbelief should not be forced. It should be the result of looking at the evidence. Tyler Vela. This is yet another question that simply cuts the atheist even deeper than it does the Christian, or Muslim, or Jew, or really any perspective one wants to launch this against. The chances of someone being an atheist in Iraq, for example, are next to none. If one had not been raised in a late modern secular nation, the chances of them being an atheist are next to nil. Another problem here is that there are plenty of adult converts who converted from entirely non-Christian homes to Christianity, myself included. So my answer would simply be a biographical yes. My parents were secular and entirely non-religious, and yet here I am as an ordained elder in a conservative Reformed Protestant denomination. Finally, depending on the follow-up for this question, the questioner may be liable to committing what is called the genetic fallacy. This fallacy occurs when one tries to invalidate the truth of a proposition or belief by attacking how someone came to believe it. Imagine that everyone only became a Christian via upbringing. Would that entail that Christians were false? Well, no. That would be the genetic fallacy. I could come to believe that the Earth orbits the sun by reading a comic book, but using this dubious means of belief formation would not invalidate whether it is true that the Earth orbits the sun. So if the questioner gets an answer in the negative, that is, that someone came to belief in the truth of Christianity because of their upbringing, what then? Where would the questioner go? It seems the point would be to then get them to doubt that their belief is therefore true. But in that doing, the questioner would need to employ the genetic fallacy. Joel Furches. Impossible to say. Children will absorb the values and views of their parent in early development, as they have not matured enough in analytical thinking to form their own views about the world. However, as children mature and develop, near their teenage years, they begin to question values and standards, and to form their own views. This is the root of what has popularly become known as teenage rebellion, the common preconception that teenagers think they know more than their parents, and boundary testing that occurs at adolescence. Psychologist Dr. Luke Galen states that, quote, while intelligence can be reliably measured at an early age, religiosity cannot. If you take a measure of a person's religiosity early on, it doesn't prove at all if they are going to be religious as an adult. Finally, it is worth considering that Christianity remains the largest world religion and still the fastest growing. Christian believers and churches are present in communist countries, Hindu countries, and Islamic countries. By sheer averages, a person is more likely to be a Christian than any other religion. So while a child is certainly going to adopt the values and worldviews of their parents, this is not a strong determiner of what values and beliefs they will hold as an adult. Regardless, the religion a person chooses and their reasons for choosing it are not the determiner of the truth or falsity of that belief. Number 3. If people from the 5 major religions are told conflicting information by their respective gods, should any of them be believed? Mark Lambert. Yes, if what the people are being told lines up with reality. The fact that there is disagreeing truth claims has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not any of them are actually true. Caleb Johnston. Contradiction does not equal equivalence, as this question implies. If truth exists, we would expect there to be various beliefs, especially if the Bible is true and men fear truth. Much like in science, 2 or more opposing views may all be wrong, but that can't all be right. However, this says nothing about the possibility that one of them could be true. Nick Peters. The next questions deal with communication from God, so I'll go into that a little bit more there. But at the outset, I will say I don't believe that hearing the voice of God is a normative practice for today. I have never heard the voice of God in my life. If I want to know what God thinks on a matter, I study Scripture. So using that as my grounds, let's suppose we took the 5 major religions and looked at what they had to say. Could we see if any of them were from God? I think there are some ways. We could look at what could be tested in those books and see how well it holds up. My main area of specialty is the New Testament, so I will stick with that. Archaeology has been a friend to the New Testament. Many findings have taken place that uphold the reliability. We are also fortunate that a work has been produced not too long ago that lists several of these. There have also been works that have focused on just one particular book, such as Acts, and some that have focused on the Gospels, as well as New Testament reliability as a whole. Naturally, I encourage people to be sure to read the other side. When I say that, I mean read actual scholars on the other side. The world of the internet is filled with people with a loud voice, but without much scholarly research. Read real scholars like Bart Ehrman, James Crossley, Michael White, John Dominic Crossan, Gerd Ludemann, Marcus Borg, Giza Vermes, and others. Of course, the real central claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead. Fortunately, Christianity has much to say here. One can listen to N.T. Wright, which is quite likely the world's top biblical scholar today. The work of Gary Habermas is excellent here, as well as including the book he wrote with Mike Licona, as well as the book that Licona himself wrote on the topic. If one wants to study other religions, by all means do so. I can say that I have read the holy works of other religions as well, and it's beneficial to know what is being said in them. The difference between Christianity is it rests itself on a claim that happened directly in space and time. That is the resurrection of Jesus. Each person will need to study on their own and find out what they think happened with Jesus. I don't ask that someone give me something like the bones of Jesus. If Jesus was a fraud, his bones are likely gone by now, and we couldn't know they were his to begin with. I just ask that they give me a better explanation that explains the data accepted by critical scholars surrounding the claimed resurrection of Jesus than the one given by the early church, the resurrection. So far, nothing has been compelling. Tyler Vella. Yet again, the question cuts back onto naturalism secularism. Once we free ourselves from only talking about religion, a questionable concept anyway, and speak on the level of worldview and belief systems, then we can see that mere disagreement is unrelated to the veracity of the various claims. For surely the 5 major religions disagree more with naturalism than with each other, and such would be more problematic for the atheist. For if disagreement is supposed to show that all disputed beliefs should be abandoned, then surely by that principle, sharply disputed beliefs should be abandoned with even more haste. Joel Furches. If people following the unification of quantum theory and gravity are told 3 conflicting things, Should any of them be believed? The presence of multiple explanations for a thing does not make each of those explanations false. This would be a fairly faulty way of thinking, because the presence of multiple theories, explanations for things, is ever present throughout history, and still is in modern times. Yet it is still possible to determine the truth about a given subject, despite conflicting information about that subject. Ultimately, when compared, whichever model best fits reality should be considered the true model. Confirmed atheist Jennifer Fulwiler began researching different religions when she began to become interested in religion. She initially avoided Christianity, dismissing it from the beginning because of a cultural bias against it. After considering every religion but Christianity, she came to discover that Christianity offered the best evidence. The same story is mirrored in the life of prominent atheist blogger Darren Raspberry, who eventually converted to Christianity. Darren describes his journey. After considering deism, the belief in a God who abandons his creation, Islam, Hinduism, yes, Krishna, don't laugh, Baha'i, and even Jainism briefly, I have decided to select Christianity due to its superior model for human evil and its reconciliation, coupled with a belief that God interacted with man directly and face-to-face, and had the crucial rote in this reconciliation. This, of course, doesn't prove that Christianity is absolutely true, although I can prove that God exists, but rather reflects my recognition that Christianity is exactly what I would expect to be the case, given that God exists.
And that's it for today's supplementary episode of the Mentionables Podcast. If you like what you heard, the Mentionables Project is available in ebook format through Amazon. Or you can go to our website, thementionables.org, and under resources, you can order a hard copy of the book. Thank you for listening, and join us next week on The Mentionables.